I call to order the 9th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance. Orders today, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, we are continuing our study of the retirement income security of Canadians. I want to thank all the witnesses for being with us here today. We have with us presenting as individuals, we have Mr. James Pirlot, we have Madame José Marin, we have from Mercer, we have Mr. Malcolm Hamilton, Senior Partner, and we have two individuals from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. We have Shirley Ann George, the Senior Vice President for Policy, and we have Sue, Rybel, Senior Vice President and General Manager, Group Savings and Retirement Solutions with Manulife Financial. Thank you so much for being with us here today. We'll start in that order. We'll start, Mr. Pirlot, with your presentation and go down the list, and then we'll have questions from members.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address my comments to the issue of adequacy of retirement savings among Canadians. How much Canadians should save for retirement depends on a number of factors. As a rough guide, it is often suggested that to maintain one's standard of living in retirement, pension income from all sources should be about 70% of pre-retirement earnings. So, for example, a retiree who was earning $60,000 annually in the last year of his or her employment should be receiving pension income from all sources of approximately $42,000. If the retiree is receiving average CPP and OAS of $12,000, he or she will need to have saved enough in a pension plan or RSP to provide a pension of about $30,000 in order to achieve a target replacement ratio of 70% of final average earnings. So how much will this $30,000 pension cost? At today's annuity purchase rates, the cost of providing $1 of pension that's indexed and provides spousal survivor benefits is about $21 if the pension starts at age 60 and $18.50 if the pension starts at age 65. This means that to have a $30,000 pension, this retiree earning $60,000 at retirement will need to have saved between $550,000 and $650,000 depending on the desired retirement age. Of course, it must be acknowledged that a pension replacing 70% of final average earnings will not be the right target for everyone. Some retirees will need more, others will need less, depending on the level of pre-retirement earnings, whether the retiree owns a home or rents, whether the retiree spouse has pension income, whether there are any dependents, and the cost of living in the area where the retiree resides. How much have Canadians saved for retirement is a difficult question to answer because the data available on private retirement saving in Canada do not provide a clear picture of how much Canadians have saved for retirement. Nevertheless, there is substantial reason to believe that Canadians working in the private sector are not saving enough for retirement and are not well prepared for retirement. According to data collected by StatsCan for 2005, median retirement savings for Canadian families in which the major income earner is close to or at retirement age are quite low. $55,000 for a family that has an RSP only, $227,000 for a family that has a pension plan only, and $245,000 for a family that has a pension plan and an RSP. Assuming retirement at age 60, these savings would deliver monthly pension incomes of $218, $900 and $972 for a family. These numbers are obviously low, and it is important to remember two things about them. First, they reflect the retirement savings of families, not individuals. Second, they're based on savings data for public and private sector workers. Since public sector workers typically have much higher rates of retirement saving, this means that private sector retirement savings must be considerably lower than these median amounts suggest. So how much have public sector workers saved? Let's take a federal public service worker as an example. In 2006-2007, the average number of years of service at retirement was 30.5, and the average retirement age was 58. Assuming a career-ending salary of $70,000 per year, a public sector worker with 30 years of service retiring at the median retirement age will collect a pension worth about $850,000 at current annuity purchase rates. For a two-income public service family, This translates into total family retirement savings about $1.7 million. This excludes any additional RRSP savings that the family may have accumulated in addition to their pension savings. The difference between public and private sector retirement saving raises a serious question as to whether the regulatory structure for retirement saving may be preventing private sector workers from accumulating adequate pensions. In the public sector, 85% of workers participate in a pension plan that provides a very good pension. But in the private sector, 75% of workers have no pension at all. Why? The answer lies primarily in unduly restrictive federal tax rules that effectively prevent most private sector workers from joining a pension plan or saving for retirement in their RSPs at the same rates that public sector and private sector workers with good pension plans do. Tax rules that prevent private sector workers from accumulating good pensions include the following. You can't join a pension plan unless you have a job with an employer who sponsors one. You can't contribute income from self-employment to a pension plan. If you lose money in your RSP or DC pension plan due to a market downturn, you can't contribute more to catch up. Quite routinely, the retirement savings of public sector workers are 5 to 7 times as much as in the private sector. This is not to suggest that public sector workers don't earn their pensions or that public sector pensions should be reduced. Most public sector pension plans are very well managed and operate cost-effectively due to their economies of scale. Indeed, one solution to the problem of inadequate retirement saving in the private sector would be to deploy the successful public sector model in the private sector and make membership available to private sector workers who have no coverage. But under current tax rules, this is not possible. So it's my view that the focus of retirement saving needs to be the reform of tax rules that prevent adequate private sector retirement saving. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Suivant, Madame Barin, s'il vous plaît.
Bonjour.
Good afternoon. I'm here to speak about Nortel's long-term disability former employees. We are a group of people affected by such illnesses such as Parkinson's, scleroderma, Crohn's disease, heart disease, and schizophrenia. Some are even institutionalized. We are in a horrendous situation because Nortel has sold us various protection, life, and long-term disability benefits, and we thought we were covered by Clarica and Sun Life, except that in 2005 we learned that Nortel assumed the risk as an insurance company. This means that Nortel should have set aside the reserves necessary for benefits to be paid out in future based on an actuarial study. I'm wondering where our benefits have gone because we had a life and disability insurance which will be disappearing in November, and there's no revenue for us. And yet Nortel did a good thing. There was a trust fund managed by an independent trustee. We've faced an abuse of confidence and trust. There's $100 million missing from the long-term disability fund. Of those $100 million, we learned following an agreement signed by Nortel that $37.1 million had been borrowed by Nortel for needs other than those of the recipients, leaving an enormous IOU in the trust fund. Nortel stopped contributing to the trust fund years before being placed under CCAA. And yet, Nortel, before ceasing its contributions, had to advise the trustee, and the trustee had to conduct an actuarial study to determine the future needs of the trust fund. That was not done, and Nortel has yet to send a notice. I'm wondering whether Nortel is trying to put off that notice as late as possible to the point where it becomes bankrupt. Moreover, the Security and Exchange Commission in the U.S. in 2005 learned that the trust fund of whom we are recipients funds were mixed in with other operating funds, which leads us to believe that Nortel could have used those funds to inflate its income. Regular people like us have no chance in a corporate bankruptcy because lawyers are paid by the corporation and without any results to be shown. Our counsel has signed a non-disclosure agreement with Nortel and Ernst & Young. And so we've been kept in the dark from the start. Worse yet, we've been controlled, we've been shut up by our lawyers group, and we have not been given real answers. Nortel should have been forced to assume its responsibilities. Unfortunately, the management at Nortel didn't live up to its expectations. The more the company declines, the more the money the council makes. What is unfortunate is that in the case of Nortel, Goodmel LLP, which represents Ernst & Young in the bankruptcy, David Richardson, who is now the chairman of Nortel, came from Ernst & Young and was hired after the bankruptcy proceedings. After Mr. Zafarowski left, Mr. Richardson was promoted to chairman with $100,000 increased in his salary by Ernst & Young. Moreover, our counsel shows us that the treatment that we've received was repugnant, and no recommendations have been made to the government for things to change. It would be to their disadvantage. Bankruptcy industry is a very lucrative industry. From the start of the bankruptcy proceedings, the superintendent and Nortel have not been honest. Mr. Doodle, who is now the president, and who saw his salary double to $1.2 million over the next year, claimed that Nortel continued to honor its obligations, and yet the trust fund is in a deficit and contributions have ceased. Moreover, Murray MacDonald, the court monitor for Ernst & Young, indicated there was a surplus in the trust fund, whereas it's in a deficit situation. And he continued to maintain that contributions were continuing to be made according to past practices. We had to wait until after the agreement to realize that there was a deficit because Ernst & Young did not disclose any of that information beforehand. I'm wondering how Nortel, a company that isn't even restructuring and claiming it doesn't have the money, can, since the start of the bankruptcy proceedings, pay over $330 million in bonuses, which are approved by the court. Those who want to prevent any changes to bankruptcy legislation. Junk bond holders will receive a few extra cents for their debt, and yet they are already making enormous profits through credit default swaps. How is it possible that the court endorse such an agreement and deprive us of our right to litigate when we are the victims of the abuse of trust and we've been deprived of fairness? And this is necessary for long-term disabled. We're expecting 17% of our revenues, whereas pensioners are guaranteed 69%, at least those who reside in Ontario. Moreover, our payments will stop in January 2011, whereas pensioners' income will continue, and I have no pension left at all. Although we've tried to appeal the decision, there's only one course of action, and that's for the government to support Bill S-216 for humanitarian reasons. We need urgent action because more lives will be lost. We've already lost 2 of our members, including one person who lost the will to live because she could no longer pay for her drugs. I would like to add that when the agreement was rendered and we learned that there was a deficit in the trust fund and that Nortel borrowed against that trust fund, we only had 10 days to hire counsel to oppose the agreement. The judge has rejected all of our reasons to oppose the agreement. and this all to the benefit of bondholders. I find this a shame to send 400 people to the street, including some who will perish. There's nothing left for me to do but to live on the streets, and I cannot live on $8,000 a year. My medical care costs alone cost $7,000. Thank you for your presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Malcolm Hamilton, and I'm a pension actuary, have been for 30 years, and I'm here speaking on my own behalf today. I'm not going to try to answer all of your questions, but I'll make some observations on 3 of them, starting with the one about how our pension system compares to other OECD countries. And my company, Mercer, it's mine in the sense that I'm employed by it, not that I own it. We created something called the Mercer Melbourne Global Pension Index last year, the purpose of which is to grade and rank retirement systems in the world. This was the inaugural run. We only looked at 11 countries, one of which was Canada. We gave them all a grade from A to D, and we ranked them. And nobody got an A. Canada was one of 4 countries to get a B. Officially, we came 4th, so we were out of the medals. But it was very close. There was no real significant difference between 1 and 4. They were all viewed as good systems. I won't bore you with how the ranking is done because it's very complicated, but the bottom line is I do believe if you lined up the world's pension experts and you gave Canadians an opportunity to change their problems for the problems of other countries, for the most part we wouldn't do it. Like I really can't think of a country that has fewer problems than Canada in the area of retirement savings. Now, understand what that means. To some extent, it's like being the tallest of the midgets. I'm not saying Canada's system is great. I'm not saying it shouldn't be improved or it can't be improved or it doesn't need to be improved. But we don't need to beat ourselves up in the sense of imagining that other countries have this right and we're the only one who has problems. You know, the top-ranked country in the Mercer Global Index was Holland. And I know if you read Dutch newspapers, reading Dutch stories about the Dutch pension system, you would think it's one of the worst in the world. And if you read Australian stories about the Australian system, they came too. You would think they had one of the worst systems in the world. So the fact is when you have financial crises, retirement savings plans do badly. That's to be expected. I think it's almost unavoidable. And when they do badly, the newspapers all over the world complain about their own systems, as they should. And what we all need to take from that is we can do a better job. We need to learn from these things, and we need to make the system stronger. But we shouldn't think that we're starting from a bad point, because we're not. Second thing I want to comment on is the notion of how do we treat underfunded pension plans when companies go bankrupt, and what do we do about the losses that pension plan members incur when that happens. Let me bore you with a little history. If you go back to the 1960s in Canada, you could have a registered pension plan and set no money aside at all. That was permitted, and it was done. And in the 1960s, people decided, and I think one of the big events at the time was Studebaker's bankruptcy, that this was no way to run a pension system. You shouldn't have a pension system where the pension disappears at the same time the employer disappears. Since that time, we funded our pensions in Canada. We started off with basically going concern funding, which is you put money in the plan on the assumption it keeps going. The only problem being that sometimes when the plans stop, even though there's enough money to keep it going, there isn't enough money to pay the benefits if the plan stops. So in the 80s, we introduced solvency funding to try to address that problem. More recently, we have another round of reforms, federally and provincially, to try to improve the situation when plans wind up. Now, none of these are going to be fully successful. The system today is much better than it was in the 60s or the 80s or 5 years ago. But the fact is, if there is a global financial calamity, if stock markets drop by 50%, if interest rates plunge, thereby raising the cost of discharging all the pension obligations, and if companies go bankrupt at the same time, if those things all come together, as they did in 2008, pension plans will be badly funded at that time, and the unlucky members of the unlucky plans that are wound up by bankrupt organizations will have an exposure and will lose benefits. And if we think we need to do something about that, and I'll point out, that's really no different than what happens to anyone with an RRSP. You know, everybody who had an RRSP, other than the few invested only in government bonds, when they got to 2008, their stocks went down, their corporate bonds went down, everything they had went down, they all lost money. So in essence, they had the same type of experience as the unlucky few in defined benefit plans whose plans wound up at that time. If you want to do something about that, there are 4 things you can look at. One is increased funding levels. Try to put so much money in pension funds that even if there are dire economic events, there's still enough money left over. Second thing is you can tell pension funds they shouldn't take so much investment risk. You know, life insurance companies with annuity promises don't put the money in the stock market. So you could tell pension funds take less risk with your investment. Third thing you can do is a national insurance arrangement like we see in the U.S. or Ontario or the U.K. They're all guaranteed money losers. They will all go bankrupt. But you know, that there still may be something to be said for that. The last thing you can look at is the one I believe that you're considering, which is saying that in that unfortunate circumstance, we will give preferred status to the members of the pension plan vis-a-vis secured and unsecured creditors. You know, I think that works, but I think it's very dangerous. Of the 4, I think all of them have undesirable consequences. None of them will be painless from the perspective of the pension system. But that last one I personally think would probably be the most painful, because everybody's sort of focusing on the fact that, well, the pensioners will go first so they'll get all their benefits. Nobody's focusing, nobody's focusing on the fact that, you know, when those companies go out to borrow money, what they're going to find is either it'll be hard to borrow, or the borrowing will come with strings. You know, like you cannot improve your pension plan, because that would, you know, if the pensioners go before the secured creditors, why would you lend money to an organization that at the last minute can improve its pension plan and take away all the security for your debt? So, these types of things need to be thought through. In the 10 seconds that remain to me, I will simply say on the issue of whether Canadians are saving enough, the one thing we know is the incomes of retired Canadians are quite good for people who never saved enough. There was never a time in my life when people were thought to be saving enough, and yet it's worked out well for the current generation. Most studies find it hard to prove that Canadians aren't saving enough, although they find it hard to prove that they are saving enough equally. So while I think there's reason for concern, and I think there are difficult circumstances going ahead, again, so far, the system's worked pretty well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. We'll now go to the Chamber of Commerce, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Shirley Ann George, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. With me today is Sue Reibel, the Senior Vice President and General Manager of the Canadian Group Retirement Solutions for Manulife Financial. Thank you for inviting us to appear. This is a hearing that matters. This is a hearing, and the study that you've undertaken will impact millions of Canadians. And Mr. Chair, we commend you and your committee for undertaking this study. As you know, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce is the most representative business association with a network of more than 340 chambers of commerce and boards of trade, as well as corporate members, and we speak for approximately 175,000 members. Given the scope of businesses we represent, each topic included in the committee's study on Canadian retirement income security is of interest to our members. However, due to the time restrictions and other presentations that you have already heard, our presentation will focus only on the third pillar of retirement savings, that is workplace pensions and RRSPs. The Canadian Chamber believes that Canada's current overall retirement savings system is sound. Legislators and policymakers need to focus rather on the improvements to the gap areas rather than fundamental changes. It is estimated that up to 50% of private sector employees have no workplace retirement savings plan. It is no surprise, then, that much of the current discussion on the retirement savings issue has focused on ensuring that private sector employees have more access to employer-sponsored retirement savings plans. There is a growing appetite to give the private sector more retirement saving options. This approach was voiced last week by Alberta's Finance Minister at the National Retirement Income Summit in Calgary and is shared by some of his counterparts. Canadian businesses need the flexibility to choose retirement savings solutions that fit their business's size and resources. At the same time, Canadians' retirement savings and income needs vary significantly. We recommend the federal, provincial, and territorial governments consider a balanced and competitive approach to retirement savings that includes more private sector options for businesses and employers. Most small and medium-sized businesses have limited or no resources to support offering retirement savings plans. This means that policy and regulatory changes should focus on improving defined contribution pensions and group RRSPs to make them less costly and easier for small and medium-sized businesses to offer. Ms. Rybel will outline specific improvements that could be made to the existing framework for employer-sponsored retirement savings plans to give more businesses the tools to help employees save for their retirement. What is needed is for all levels of government to work together and with private sector providers to make it happen. Doing so has the potential to benefit millions of Canadians who have either no or insufficient retirement savings. I will now turn to Ms. Rybel.
Thank you, Shirley-Ann. As Shirley-Ann mentioned, I am responsible for overseeing Manulife's group retirement business. At Manulife, we provide employee benefits and retirement solutions to more than 20,000 businesses and 3.5 million Canadians. We support businesses with 2 employees and businesses with 40,000 employees. I have spent a significant amount of time over the last year talking to business owners and their advisors about their retirement programs. In some cases, they have decided not to offer such programs to their employees. For the purposes of this discussion, there are a number of things that we need to address through regulatory and legislative changes to increase, 1, access to more businesses and to encourage more businesses to offer workplace retirement programs. And second, once we have a program in place, enhance participations and savings of the employees when a plan is there. Let me begin with increasing access to employer-sponsored retirement programs. Most Canadians who do not have a workplace pension work for small and medium businesses. These employers find pension rules difficult and costly and instead look to group RSPs, which are more flexible and easier to administer, and that's when they do decide to offer a plan. There are a number of obstacles in play that are preventing access to such plans. Then this can be addressed through 2 avenues. First, changing the defined contribution pension regulations in 11 jurisdictions in Canada to simplify the regulations and allow for multi-employer pension plans. Second, are changes to the Income Tax Act that will strengthen group RSPs to give them more pension-like qualities. Using the existing RSP framework, the Government of Canada can quickly and effectively, with minimal cost, significantly improve existing plans and encourage more plans. The changes to the Income Tax Act would include the following. First, allow multi-employer plans within the group framework. This would reduce administration and compliance costs and provide economies of scale. Second, lock in employer contributions. Current group RSPs do not legislatively restrict access to retirement savings. The ability of workers to access, especially their employer contributions, make group RSPs unattractive to many business owners. It also makes employers hesitant to match employees' contributions. Third, limit portability. While they continue to be employed by the sponsoring employer, employees should not be permitted to transfer further locked-in assets out of the plan. When employees switch employers or retire, they will have the option to transfer their group RSP to one offered by their new employer into a DC plan or another locked-in savings plan. And finally, apply pension-like tax treatments to contributions and payouts. Unlike employer contributions into a pension plan, employer payments to a group RSP attract EI insurance and CPP. Employer contributions to a group RSP should not attract either of these taxes. And finally, on payouts from a pension plan can be split between spouses at age 55. Income received from an RSP can only be split at age 65. Once an employee has access to an employer-sponsored retirement program, there are a number of regulatory and legislative changes that will enhance participation in savings. They include automatic enrollment for employees with the ability to opt out, and allowing employers to re-enroll their employees at set intervals, thereby capturing employees whose personal circumstances have changed and no longer wish or need to opt out. And the second is allowing for auto-escalation of employee contributions, and that will increase over time with either a pay raise or a promotion. We believe these improvements to the existing framework for employer-sponsored retirement savings plans will be stronger and create more flexibility for businesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentations. We'll now start with Mr. McCallum. You have 7 minutes for questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, et merci à tous nos témoins.
Thank you to all our witnesses for appearing before our committee this afternoon. I'd like to begin with a comment for Ms. Marin, and that I'd like to say I'm very aware of your problem, and it's a very serious problem. And that is why there's the bill by Senator Art Eggleton, which was tabled in the Senate. The problem is that process might take a long time, and understand you don't have that time. But I did ask the question twice in question period to the government. Because if the government supported you, we could fast-track the process. We asked the government, and up to now, we have yet to receive a response, or a positive response. But we're doing what we can. I understand, and I do hope that the government will understand the urgency of the situation. I do understand that urgency and the scope of the problem.
Rebel? Sorry. And basically, I agree with at least the thrust of what you have said, that it would be a good idea to have multi-employer pension plans, to break down barriers, to expand such plans, to have this private sector solution. But the question I've also asked to other private sector people who have come before us is, I favor that, but I favor as well a supplementary Canada pension plan. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think the two can coexist. And an important principle of economics, I think, is more choice is usually better than less choice for consumers. And there's some advantages of what you propose for some people, some advantages of a voluntary, I should say, supplementary Canada pension plan. So the question I'm asking you is, would you accept that this might be a good idea, that we go along with your proposal and simultaneously a supplementary Canada pension plan that is voluntary in nature?
I think the possibility does exist that the two could work simultaneously. The thing I would urge the government to explore are, there's two things. The first is the associated cost of building such a plan within the government and the impact that would have on setting the fees for such a plan. If you look to the UK experience right now, it is very challenging for them. They have embarked on a supplementary government-run plan and have determined that it's going to cost them considerably more, and as a result they've had to levy a 2% charge on every deposit that goes into that plan, because it cost them almost $1 billion to set the plan up. So
That's a one-time cost, is it?
It's the initial...
Not an annual cost.
The setup plus then the annual on top of, in addition. So it's been more costly than what they assumed. You have to understand that the CPP as it exists right now is set up as a defined benefit plan.
Right.
And a supplement would be essentially a defined contribution plan. They run on different engines and require different infrastructure that the government would have to build. The second piece to consider is that whenever the government embarks on something sponsored by them, rightly or wrongly, there's an implied guarantee or the expectation that the government will be there. Again, this is a defined contribution supplement, and the government has to understand that Canadians, rightly or wrongly, will assume the government will be there to cover their losses. So it's something that you have to go in with your eyes open on. It's not saying you can't be overcome, but they're just things to consider.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure I agree with the second point, but we would certainly have to look into cost, although CPP investment boards seem to think it could be done. Now, Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Pirlo, I know you know about this topic, even though you didn't speak about it today, but I'd just like it if you could perhaps comment on whether you agree with the coexistence of a private sector solution and a supplementary CPP?
My view on a supplementary CPP is that it can be workable if it's a defined contribution arrangement and it's voluntary, or at least you can opt out if it's automatic enrollment. I think the concern, I mean, there's different iterations of a supplementary Canada pension plan. One, some people talk about expanding the defined benefit guarantee under the current CPP, or increasing the YMP, or increasing the benefit amount. The other is having the defined contribution arrangement. If it's the first, in other words, if it's an expansion of the current CPP, you have to make it mandatory for everyone. If it's going to be defined contribution accounts...
I'm talking about defined contribution voluntary.
Yeah, I think that Sue has identified a number of the challenges associated with setting it up. There's going to be communication challenges when people, if they have any exposure to market risk with their investments, and their account balances go down, then you're going to have to somehow communicate to them why. But I think my biggest concern about a supplementary CPP, and I don't think it's insurmountable, is the aggregation of a very large amount of money in government hands. Compare the performance in 2008, 2009 of the CPP fund and the QPP fund.
Okay.
One did 25% worse than the other.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but I wanted to give Mr. Hamilton a chance, and we've got about 30 seconds.
Just a short answer, Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you. I guess I don't see why you can't proceed with both. It seems to me the private solution will be ready well before the public one. It is going to take the Brits 5 years, and that's 5 years from deciding what they wanted to do, and we're not at the deciding what we wanted to do stage yet. So it seemed to me the prudent thing to do would be to eliminate the barriers to the private sector solution working, get some task group figuring out if this doesn't solve all of the problems, what kind of a Canada supplementary pension plan do we need to launch, but hold off deciding absolutely whether you need to launch it until this has its opportunity. I am worried the Canada supplementary will crowd this out as an alternative if both were made available at the same time.
Okay.
Head start.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. McCallum. Monsieur Paillet, s'il vous plaît, pour 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Indeed, Mr. Hamilton, you're right not to say that it is my company when you speak of Mercer. It's like when Mr. Wallace talks about my government, I prefer it not be him in charge. So it is said that we have a very good pension system, Mr. Hamilton. But when we compare our situation, nevertheless, there are people like at Atlas, at Nortel, at a number of companies. 50% of people in the private sector don't have a pension plan. So it's all fine and well to say that we have the best system in the world. The fact is, we shouldn't stick our head in the sand and not want to improve it. I'd have one question with regard to what you said concerning, I call this an urban legend with regard to financing. A number of witnesses have appeared here and said that if employee pension plans became secured in case of bankruptcy and that companies could no longer find financing and would have to face huge interest rates. And that's not true. That's simply not true. I think that raising financing to buying corporate debt, I mean, that all that is subject to a risk analysis, and investors would never stop from investing in a good, solid corporation. And perhaps it would have positive benefits because those people would pay closer heed to situations like that at Nortel and could follow a corporation much or scrutinize it much closer. So I would like to know where, because you have a lot of experience in financing, where you come with the idea that it would be very costly and in some cases impossible to finance. So where do you take that information? Where does the urban legend come from?
It's an urban legend because we haven't had the issue on the table. I'm not an expert in bankruptcy, and I'm not an expert in the corporate raising of money. But I guess what I would observe is the following. If I was lending money to a corporation that didn't have a defined benefit pension plan, and I was told that if that corporation adopted a rich defined benefit plan, even if that was adopted after I lent them the money, and then they went under with no money in the pension fund, that all of the pensioners who had been given a pension in that last year would get the corporate money before I, who lent the corporation money, got repaid. I assume what I would do is put in the debt covenant that there are things with pensions that you, the corporation, are not allowed to do in exchange for accepting this loan. So I think borrowers will be rightfully very concerned about corporate amendments that improve pension plans with no money in the pension fund to pay for them. And they'll be rightfully concerned about corporations having risky investment policies, knowing that, what oftentimes happens is companies go bankrupt at unfortunate times when stock markets are down. So if they've taken a risky investment policy, again, the creditors are the parties exposed. So I just think there'll be a lot of strings attached to the loans that go to those corporations. And they'll decide it would be better not to have a pension plan, or if they have a pension plan, better not to improve the pension plan, because it will make their borrowing situation quite complicated.
J'aurais tendance à être...
I would tend to agree with you to say that, yes, debt covenants for major corporations are extremely complex documents with a lot of negative aspects to them, a lot of conditions imposed. And yes, creditors might wonder whether the pension plan at Nortel, whether it was proper to hold that at an arm's length trust fund. And perhaps we could make sure, or the companies could make sure that they have the means to provide the benefits that they, because we're talking about deferred wages here with the pensions. And I'd like to ask a question to Ms. Marin. Through your contact with government, because you're in a very urgent situation, there's a bill in the Senate. We here are at the House of Commons, and we do hope that bill will make it to the House at one point so that we could take a look at that. The only elected members in Parliament here are members of the House. I'm wondering whether you've had any contacts with government members in order to bring that bill quickly to the House. Well, I mean, the bill was presented, but I'd let Mr. McCallum comment on that. Of course, we tried to share our stories with people, make people understand that there are lives at stake, and the situation is very critical, and that bill has to move forward and make it to the House of Commons as quickly as possible. And it has to be adopted before the Parliament arises for the summer, because it's a tragedy. Perhaps this is behind the scenes, but it's a tragedy nevertheless. And perhaps Mr. McCollum, in order for him to respond, we'd have to be in government, and we'd have to call an election. I'd like to get some explanation from you, Ms. Reibel. You say on page 7 that employers would hesitate to contribute up to par with employees in a multi-employer fund, and they have to prevent employees from removing their savings. But a contribution to a pension plan is a deferred wage.
I was referring to a group RRSP. There are no restrictions right now. So what employers are concerned about is the fact that they will contribute to their employees' retirement program, and then a year later the employee takes that money out of their retirement program and buys a big screen TV. It's not, they're contributing to their employees' retirement and they're not using the money for retirement. That's one of the reasons. So when I talk to employers, that's what they're saying. I'd rather give the money somewhere else.
Thank you. Merci. We'll go to Mr. Hebert, please, for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to continue that line of questioning, in your written comments, you make the note that you suggest that the government lock in employer contributions. Are you not suggesting that they lock in employee contributions as well?
Obviously, that would be very desirable from a long-term savings perspective. But that, again, is a very significant change to RSP regulations. And it's really the government's call how far to push that. A lot of employers would prefer both pieces to be locked in, and the desire to have Canadians save more for retirement and have the money there for retirement, locking in would be desirable. But that goes against, I think, the framework of our registered retirement savings plans. It could be done, but it's a question. But for sure, employers are looking to have their contributions locked in for retirement.
So that the employees could not take out the employer portion.
Correct.
Now, isn't there a problem of commingling?
No, we segregate. So our record-keeping systems segregate the employer contributions from the employee contributions, and we track them.
I see.
So that they wouldn't be commingled.
Okay. Mr. Pirlo, you were commenting a few minutes ago about the comparison between the private and government returns on pension investments. You didn't really get a chance to elaborate, but you were referring to the CPP versus the QPP, I believe?
That's correct.
Could you just finish your line of thinking there in terms of, I mean, I've seen the returns from the CPP myself, and sometimes wonder if there wouldn't be a better way to invest. Can you elaborate?
Well, I'm not an investment expert. My expertise is legal, but I have observed from just simply reading the reports for the Canada Pension Plan and the Quebec Pension Plan that there's been a pretty wide divergence in the rates of returns of those plans through the last economic downturn. And the divergence is about 25%, so it's really significant.
Who was higher? Who was lower?
The CPP was higher. And I understand that the reason is that the CPP had very little exposure to asset-backed commercial paper, and the QPP, or the Caisse Populaire, the Caisse de dépôt et placement de Québec, had more exposure to that. Now, these large government pension funds operate pretty cost-effectively and have generally delivered pretty good returns, but I think when you put all of that money into the hands of a few investment managers, what you've got is a diversification risk. When you have all of this pension money being managed in the private sector by all of these different managers, if one of them makes a mistake, it doesn't affect everybody. Whereas if you aggregate more money than we currently have in the hands of a few investment managers, if they do well, great. But what if they make a mistake? We all lose.
So diversification is
the issue, and there are solutions to that. For example, you could take blocks of a supplementary CPP fund and you could farm it out to private sector so that if any one group of investment managers didn't do well, it wouldn't affect the entire fund. Mm-hmm. There are ways around that problem.
You also mentioned in your opening remarks a need for reform. Specifically, you commented that currently not any employee can join a pension plan without the employer who sponsors it. Are you suggesting then that self-employed individuals or employees who have an employer who doesn't want to sponsor a plan should be allowed to join their own pension plan? And how would that be different than just simply investing in their own RSP?
Well, the reason it would be different is because there are two kinds of pension plans that are permitted under the Income Tax Act. There's defined benefit and defined contribution. Defined contribution works just like an RSP. Defined benefit, they're the more complex arrangements that allow you to fund toward a particular target retirement benefit. In a defined benefit pension plan, there's aggregation of risk and there's aggregation of assets. And that presents opportunities to have more flexible investment policies and also to lower costs. Under the current tax rules, individuals are not allowed to pay for their own defined benefits. An employer must do it.
Is there a reason for that policy?
It's a historical restriction that dates back to the very beginning of pension saving when it started in 1917 under the Income Tax Act, where at that time you could only have employer contributions to a pension plan. That changed, I think it was 1946, when employee contributions were permitted. But those restrictions have carried through, and the Income Tax Act essentially says you can only have pension contributions in respect of your office, your income from an office or employment, which means employment income, and your employer has to pay for those defined benefit pension benefits. Under the Income Tax Act, the amount of money that you can put away for retirement is much greater under a defined benefit arrangement than it is under an RSP. So there's this real inequality between the two kinds of plans. And this is one of the reasons why the public sector plans are better, because they're all defined benefit. So what I'm really suggesting is here, disaggregate the employment relationship from pension savings so that anybody can contribute any taxable income to any pension arrangement within an aggregate lifetime tax limit. So essentially eliminate the distinction between defined benefit and defined contribution and just give everybody the same limit and allow anybody to contribute up to that limit in any arrangement they desire, whether it be a pension plan or an RSP.
Okay, 30 seconds.
Last question to Mr. Hamilton. You talked about strings being attached to lenders, by lenders to companies with pension plans. If this change was to occur, do you think that fewer corporations would offer pensions because of the strings attached with financing their companies from a startup perspective and on?
It would be a complication. Now, in all honesty, corporations right now are not looking to start up defined benefit plans. That's one of the reasons there's so much concern about the decline in defined benefit plan coverage. So if nobody's starting them up anyway, this isn't going to be that big a change. I do think it'll make the ones who are struggling to continue plans regret more strongly that they have the plans if they find out that to access the capital markets they've got to deal with these very complicated loan covenants.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hebert. We'll go to Mr. Marsden, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Moran, before we go any further, I find it difficult when you're sitting here and we're talking so much about pensions and you have the particular issue facing you. You do. I mean, we've proposed to the government through a bill that I put in the potential for change. We certainly will support the Liberal bill if it comes to the House of Commons. We've asked the government to do whatever they can do. In fact, the purchase of annuities of a couple of $100 million, it doesn't sound huge, but that could take care of this situation. So there's a variety of things that are still potential out there. Mr. McCollum talked earlier about the supplemental CPP. Ms. Raybell, I wouldn't mind directing this to you or anybody else who wants to respond. The NDP has proposed a similar thing, But rather than a supplemental, which will be on the side with new administration, we're talking about growing the core assets for the CPPIB to manage. Right now it's 4.45% for employer and 4.45% that's put in by the employee to the CPP. And we're saying, you know, increase 2.5 for employer, 2.5, and over a 40-year plan, grow it. We're looking at an existing framework. We have the OAS, we have CPP, and we're thinking in terms of the fact, and I think it was in your report that you talked about 50% of people didn't have it. Well, overall workers is about 63% that have zero savings and no pension whatsoever. So I'm curious, because if we increase at the lower end for everybody, I don't see that as taking away from those people who are secure enough financially to invest themselves. I'd like your comments on that, if you would. As to, I'm sorry, and it would be mandatory. So the increasing the benefit or the premiums and the cash in the base of the CPP as opposed to supplemental and the added cost.
I think that I'd like Shirley Ann to support me on this answer as well, because she's representing a large population of Canadian businesses in this. I agree that there is an infrastructure that exists there for the existing plan, and adding on to it from an ease of use perspective is there. I think we have to look at the impact of mandatorily increasing contributions on the economy and on business, and I think that's a good spot for Shirley Ann to comment.
Yes, anything that would in essence be a payroll tax in one form or another would definitely be of concern, especially to small businesses in Canada who are trying to get out of a very difficult downturn. So we need to think, if 2% may sound small, but 2% over a broad base of employees can be a significant cost, especially when we're facing very high increases in EI premiums coming.
Well, we understand, but also, as you heard about the British experience, it's going to take some time to do whatever it is we do. Hopefully, going forward, we'll be somewhat better off than we have been before. Mutual funds, just out of curiosity, what would be the administration fee per year on a mutual fund, percentage-wise?
Percentage-wise, they generally are somewhere, depending on the type of fund and the complexity of it, between 2% and 3%, and that includes advice in that. So there's an advice model, and there's support by the individual that is selling that mutual fund to provide financial support and advice to the buyer. So you have to be aware of that too.
Not to go too far into it, but one of the problems I think somebody indicated too is people who wanted to invest themselves have the difficulty of all of those choices. Again, coming back to CPPIB and the fact that if you increase the core assets, part of that cost is equal to the administration fees, was a point I'd like to make. Mr. Hamilton, you were talking about, I was the one who put the bill in the House in regards to preferred status in the times of bankruptcy. As we all know, in CCAA, the judge will follow the letter of the law, and rather than point a nasty finger to judge, that's what they're required to do. So when we look for change in it, one of the statements is that the investment climate because of that would change. I've raised in a previous meeting the fact that in Australia they tabled a study in 2005 where they said there was just a very marginal change, and in their case, of course, they're still considered one of the top 4 places to invest in the world. Are you aware of that study? Or?
I'm not aware of the study. Australia has a largely defined contribution system. They've basically abandoned defined benefits, so I don't know why they'd even have the issue.
I couldn't respond to that. One of our witnesses spoke. Yes.
There's one thing I wanted to observe, I guess, about the priority creditor status issue. I think we need to ask ourselves the question, why is it that you have people from Nortel who are demonstrating in front of legislatures when they lose their pensions, but then you have a very large group of DC and RSP investors who are not? And I think the reason why is because when people were working for Nortel, someone made them a promise. They promised them a pension. And in the case of all of the people in DC plans and RSPs, a pension was not promised. They were told that they would get a contribution to their pension plan, or they made contributions themselves, and then they went through a market downturn, they lost money, but they understood that. And I think that this is an important thing to remember in terms of how we're going to design the retirement savings system going forward.
And this is a leg of it, and I agree with you, but in the case of Abitibi, Bowater, Fraser Paper, Nortel, they were all promised that their deferred wages would be there for them. And in the case of the LTD, the monies were not set aside.
Okay,
and so we're talking about changing the CCAA and BIA to account for that, to offer workers the protection they need.
Right, and the reason why I bring this issue of the promise up is because essentially I think that what's really been going wrong with defined benefit pension plans in these situations that you mentioned is that people have been told something that's not true, and they're upset about it. They were relying on a promise and they didn't get it.
Wages that are being abused.
And but it raises the question as to whether these plans were sustainable, or that model was sustainable, or whether we need something more like a target benefit pension plan model where there's an explicit understanding from the beginning that there's risk.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Mr. McKay for a 5-minute round.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses. I wanted to focus on the 4 comments that you made, Mr. Hamilton. First of all, the 4th comment with respect to the urban legend, it does make perfectly good sense that a lender would be a bit more hesitant if, in fact, they knew in a bankruptcy or an insolvency that that they would rank in a lower priority. Now, does your concern apply? That makes perfectly good sense with respect to a defined benefit plan. Does the same concern apply with a defined contribution plan?
No. But defined contribution plans virtually can't wind up with deficiencies. You know, what happens when you have the 2008 is everybody's account balance drops just as fast as the assets.
Yeah.
So you end up with a perfectly solvent plan where everybody's benefit is substantially reduced. In the defined benefit, you know, the pension stays up, the assets disappear. That's the thing that causes the deficiency that is the source of the underfunding.
Okay. The conversation that hadn't been at least clear to me. The second point had to do, or your third point had to do with national insurance, which you didn't really expand, and you seemed to think that was a really lousy idea. So I wasn't quite sure why you thought it was such a lousy idea.
Well, it's not that it's a lousy idea. It's it's been tried in Ontario, and the Ontario government just had to throw in $500 million. It's been tried in the U.S., it's insolvent. It's been tried in the U.K., it's sort of insolvent, and that's a more recent experiment. The problem is it's not clear that you can insure this risk, because the main problem with this insurance is if you try to charge the ones with the biggest risks, you find they're the ones who can least afford to pay. And this is a real problem when you have an insurance system where the big bill goes to the organization least able to pay the big bill. So nobody has yet found a way to do this in a way that is totally self-supporting. Now, I have no objection. If governments want to say, look, we're going to do this, we know it's a money loser. You know, we know it will, from time to time, go insolvent and need bailing out, and the taxpayers will bail it out, and we think that's a good use of public money. That's fine. You know, the problem with it is obvious, though, in that the taxpayers include many people who don't have pensions, and what they're told is from time to time money will be used to bail out the ones with pensions. But if we want to go there, let's just be open. Most governments so far have really not been open about it. They say we're doing this, it's going to be self-supporting, the government won't have to put any money in, but when the hard times come, the government has to put money in.
You make a very good point. The problem is that ultimately it ends up being the taxpayer, no matter how you slice it, one way or another. That if a bank, like our friends here in Nortel, who's going to bail? Bad choice of words. Who's going to supplement what they've obviously lost, other than the taxpayers of Canada? And so, directly or indirectly, honestly or dishonestly, it becomes a taxpayer-funded solution, in which case, I guess the question is, why wouldn't you at least try to mitigate your anticipated loss with some form of insurance on private pension plans?
You mean government insurance or private insurance?
Well, in effect, each plan pays some form of insurance to against the bankruptcies of themselves.
I have no problem going down that road, but let's just be honest about it. Everybody's tried to find a way to make that self-supporting. To date, nobody has succeeded. It's a difficult thing to do, but if we think that that's a good use of public funds, let's just say that from time to time it will lean on government, and we think that's appropriate.
1 minute.
Your third point had to do with taking less risk, and certainly the distinction between CPP and QPP was a pretty valid point of distinction. How would you describe to pension managers what is less risk?
Well, in defined benefit plans, less risk is picking assets that track the liabilities, which typically means long-term government bonds. Now, if you had a pension fund in 2008 and it was all in long-term government bonds, and you were fully funded at the beginning of the year, you were fully funded at the end of the year. But here's the problem. You can tell pension plans to go down that road. The next thing they look at is what kind of return are they going to get on long-term government bonds, and the answer right now is 4%.
QPP versus CPP problem, they wanted quick returns, they wanted to boost their basis, and as a consequence, they ate it.
The one thing we know is they don't want 4% returns. So in the 90s, this looked great because you could go to safe assets and get decent returns. Right now, it's pretty lean if you try to de-risk the pension plan.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Carrier, s'il vous plaît, pour 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. 5 minutes, Mr. Carrier. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, to begin. My first question is for Mr. Hamilton. Earlier, I was surprised to hear you mention that things were running pretty smoothly here in Canada, that we were in 4th position worldwide, and you seem to be saying that your company is specialized in classifications of countries with regard to pension funds, so you've been analyzing all the pension plans out there, and despite what we're seeing, and despite all the meetings that we've been holding to see how we could improve the pension system, now this is all based on the fact that a number of companies' employees are faced with nothing given the deficits of their pension plans. And yet you're saying that things are going well and there aren't many changes that are needed. You're probably not affected by the problems faced by those employees to say such things. And I wonder whether you wouldn't have a solution to bring forward to try to avoid the kind of situations that we've seen recently. My party presented a bill to at least take into account the income lost on their pension plans so that they receive refundable tax credits at the end of the year. And the NDP also presented a bill so that people could be given a preferred creditor status in case of bankruptcies. Would you have any suggestions to bring forward to improve our system in order to avoid repeated situations?
2 questions. What I said earlier is that relative to other countries, our system works pretty well. If you think there are countries around the world that didn't have a problem with 2008 where the pensioners are fine, give me the list at some point because I'm not aware of them. Now, the second thing is let's understand what we're talking about here. There's the pension system, and then there's the economic system. Okay? What we had in 2008 wasn't a pension crisis. It was an economic crisis. It was a financial markets crisis. It took all the assets down. What most pension systems are built on retirement savings in the sense that they have big pools of assets. And the bigger the pool of asset you had, the more money you lost in 2008. The big plans lost money. The little RRSPs lost money. The only people who didn't lose money are people who invested entirely in government bonds. So if the question is what do people have to do to avoid a recurrence of 2008, it's to have a pension system built entirely on government bonds earning 4%. And the problem is that turns out to be a safe but unaffordable system. If you work out the cost of good pensions with 4% returns, you get like the federal public sector plan, 34% of pay. Most people don't think they can afford to pay 34% of pay for a pension plan. So you have to decide at some point whether you're going to learn to take the risk and deal with the risk or whether you want to avoid the risk. If, as most systems do, we decide to take the risk, one of the things you have to resign yourself to is when those very rare years come along like 2008, there will be problems.
I only have about a minute left. Do you not think that, given that by improving the CPP, wouldn't that be a more secure way than to depend on private corporations such as Nortel, and where agreements aren't made to the benefit of employees? And at least with a CPP, employees could depend on more secure income. The Chamber of Commerce and Manulife did not suggest any options because they'd be in a conflict of interest because they propose employer-sponsored retirement plans. So it's good for business, but for employees, it's not a very secure way of.
Be brief, yeah.
Very brief.
I'm not averse to expanding the CPP. I would do it by taking the earnings ceiling up, not by taking the 25% up. But here's the thing. Any extension of the CPP now, in order to treat the children fairly, has to be fully funded. And you should ask the question, if the existing CPP had been large and fully funded, it would have had $2 trillion going into 2008. That's what a fully funded large CPP would have looked like. It would have lost $400 billion in 2008. That's what would have happened, and there would have been pain. So that the notion that if we set the big asset pool up in the QPP and the CPP, when the bad years come along, there won't be pain. There'll still be pain.
Okay, thank you. Merci. Monsieur Généreux, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mr. Généreux. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hamilton, I'd like to follow up on the last question. With regard to privileged creditors, I was listening to Ms. Marin, looking at her reaction when we were talking about percentages of returns for pension plans to ensure their minimal survival. But Ms. Marin is here to share with us a human drama. We're not talking about interest rates that will come and save her. And if I were in her shoes, I would like to hear something that figures are all fine and well, but there are humans behind all these dramas. When we talk about privileged or secured creditors with regard to corporations, and I'm referring back to Mr. Payet's question, would that be an impediment for corporations to continue to create jobs and to ensure proper benefits for their employees in retirement?
It's to ask the corporations that than to ask me. I think it would complicate the borrowing of money for some of them, and but they would know that better than me. I want to point out something else. The way these plans are supposed to work, pension plans used to be unfunded, and then they were funded. The proper way to protect people when these events happen is to have better funded pension plans taking less investment risk. That's what insurance companies do when they write annuities. They take the money in, they buy bonds, they don't take huge investment risks, they're well capitalized, and so in 2008, the annuity payments continue. The disability payments continue. The life insurance payments continue. So if what we want to do is have more secure either disability benefits, pension benefits in these plans, the natural place to start is with the funding requirements and with the investment rules, as opposed to how do you try to clean up the mess once the sponsor goes under and there isn't enough money? Because it's very hard to sort of clean up the mess once you've allowed the mess to happen.
Okay. Vous parliez aussi des barrières que...
You talked about barriers earlier to implement effective private pension plans. What exactly were you referring to?
C'est peut-être Madame Georges ou...
Was Ms. George or Ms. Reibel?
When we look at small businesses and what it takes to put a pension in place or a retirement program, especially when you get to businesses with less than 100 employees, they just don't have the administrative capabilities and the staffing resources to support such a thing. They have an office manager who does 10 or 15 things, and they are not retirement experts or pension experts. And we have seen numerous companies get into trouble trying to meet the compliance requirements associated with pensions. So a lot of them just decide it's not worth the aggravation to support and offer such a thing to their employees. They'd rather just give them the cash.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we hear stands in the way of smaller employers putting a plan in front of their employees. So one is making it easier for employers, and then the second is making it easier for employees then to participate.
Okay. Parce que je suis membre d'ailleurs de votre organisation.
I myself am a member of your organization. I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm an employer. I have 20 employees. And we never were able to implement that within our corporation because we didn't have the resources to. A witness at a previous meeting talked about multi-employer pension plans. Now, I don't know what the Chamber of Commerce thinks about that possibility.
We do offer multi-employer insurance plans in a number of different ways. To have the opportunity to also offer a multi-employer pension plan is something that we would definitely look at if it was an option for us, but right now the law does not allow that.
Okay, your time is... It's about 10
En fait,
seconds.
j'aurais une dernière question pour...
Sorry, I think we're done. Okay, merci. We'll go to Mr. McCallum again, please.
Thank you. I'd like to share my time with Mr. McKay. I just have one question for Mr. Hamilton about how good our pension system is compared with other countries, and your index had put us number 4 out of 11. I was just looking at some OECD statistics. I think they were the most recent ones. And for the average worker, I think it's the mean salary. If I remember the numbers correctly, the replacement rate for Canada was 44% on average for the average worker, while that of the OECD average is about 56%. So according to that measure, we're definitely below average by OECD standards. And I would have thought replacement rate for the average worker is a fairly key statistic. We're better than average on the lower income side. I think we're slightly worse than average on the higher income side, and we're definitely worse than average for the average person. So I wondered how you'd react to that, or if you think that's an important indicator.
Okay, let's understand what that statistic is. That isn't the replacement rate of someone with average income in Canada. That's the replacement rate for someone with average income in Canada who's not a member of a workplace pension plan and who never saves a dime their whole life. That's basically what they get from government benefits. It's what they get from Old Age Security, Canada Pension Plan, and Guaranteed Income Supplement. And what that comparison's doing is it's saying if we just look at government pensions, don't look at private savings, don't look at workplace pensions, just look at government pensions. How does Canada compare to other countries? And you're quite right. We compare very well if you're half the average wage. That's the place where Canada is relatively strong. We have a big safety net for low-income workers. At the average wage, we are less than other OECD countries on average, and at the high end, we're very low compared to the other OECD countries. But that is just looking at government benefits. Now, what we would be looking at is a retirement system. We're not trying to assess the adequacy of government benefits. The issue is when you combine in the workplace pensions with the government pensions and with personal savings, how does the income of retired Canadians compare to people elsewhere? And so the statistic I find more revealing is the OECD did a study where they said, let's look at the after-tax income of seniors in Canada versus working Canadians. So after-tax income, and let's adjust for family size, to recognize that families need more money because they have more people to support with their family income. The ratio in Canada was 90%, i.e. seniors' after-tax income adjusted for family size was 90% what it was for working people. If you looked at the OECD countries, I think we were third of the 20 or so countries. And the conclusion is when you look at all sources of retirement income, our system was doing pretty well. Now, again, I'm not advocating complacency. I'm not saying because it's okay today for people already retired, we can safely assume that it will be okay 20 years from now for people now age 45. But as far as how the system's doing today, it stacks up pretty well.
Okay, thank you.
You've got 1 minute.
1 minute? How do I always end up at the short end of the stick? Anyway, Ms. Rival, the premise that you have with respect to changes to the Income Tax Act seems to me that you want essentially an employee locked into the plan. In fact, in your third point, you say limit the portability when they continue to be employed by the sponsor. Employees should not be permitted to transfer their assets out of the plan. Can you explain that and the rationale behind that?
Well, one of the advantages of an employer-sponsored plan is aggregation of people, and that drives costs down. And so to the benefit of all of the individuals in the plan, having active employees remain in the plan and keeping their assets in the plan helps from an economies of scale.
It works for you. I don't see how it works for me.
No, because that gets passed on to the members. It all pushes through. So the more members, the more assets, the lower the fees. So if you restrict movement while they're actively employed by their employer, that grows the assets. It would work the same way in a pension as well. So in Canada, any pension plan, the more assets and the more people, the lower the cost. So it encourages, and it also is for the benefit of the individual as they're receiving some significant value from their employer-sponsored plan.
Okay, thank you. We can come back to you, Mr. McKay, after Ms. Block. Ms. Block, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our guests for being here. I've certainly enjoyed the debate that's been going on here today. Recently, I read in the Umbach-Shear letter, the April edition of the Umbach-Shear letter entitled High Noon for Pension Reform from Debates to Decisions, and I want to quote where they state, "We have had the good fortune to be an active participant in this process since the beginning, both as a contributor and as a listener of this debate." And it goes on to say, here we offer our updated thoughts on each of the three major issues set out above and how they might be resolved. In doing so, we are mindful of Roger Martin's observation that the discovery of better answers should continue until the very end of the design process. And I guess I want to build on what you said, Ms. George. You began your opening remarks by stating that this is a hearing that matters and that any changes made will have an impact on Canadians for years to come. And I believe that, which is why, you know, our Conservative government is taking the time to conduct the kind of consultations that we have through this committee, our Minister of Finance and our Parliamentary Secretary, and certainly we see what's going on with the provinces. You also stated in your remarks that the Canadian Chamber believes that Canada's current overall retirement savings system is sound, and that legislators and policymakers need to focus on improvements in the gap areas rather than fundamental changes. Can you just quickly recap for me what you would see those gap areas being? And then I'm wondering if you can comment as a national organization the need for policymakers, both provincially and federally, to work together?
Thank you for that question. I think the gap area that we were focused primarily on looking at today is the gap where 50% of employees and the self-employed simply don't have access to pension plans. And that's a serious problem that needs to be addressed. So we would urge this committee to make sure that in any report that you have that you clearly recommend that gap be filled, and along with some recommendations on how to do it. On your second question, I apologize. Could you repeat it?
Just in your role as a national organization, certainly representing municipalities or businesses from across the country, can you comment on the need, if you see the need for the provinces and the federal government to work together in, I guess, a solution, or what solutions we have to come up with?
One of the challenges that the private sector faces today in filling that gap is, and one of the costs that especially small businesses have to face, is that there's different legislation in the provinces and in the federal government. And some sort of cooperation or harmonization that would just reduce those costs is one more way that would encourage companies to provide pensions for their employees.
Okay, thank you.
Got about a minute. Want to give it to you? Okay, Mr. Menzies.
Sure, thank you very quickly. I wanted to pick up, I've got all kinds of questions, and thank you for everyone for being here, but I wanted to pick up on Ms. Rabel's comment about the UK. Did I totally screw up that name?
That's okay.
My apologies. The UK, now we just heard recently that the original cost to this UK voluntary plan was 35 basis points. Now, apparently the minister that's attempting to put it together is saying we need about 8 to 10 more years to do this, and oh, by the way, it's going to be 200 basis points higher. So Mr. McCallum is saying that's a wonderful idea. Who on earth is going to pay that?
Those numbers are correct. It was 30 basis points was the expected annual cost. And they've recently announced that they're going to levy a 2% charge on every contribution that comes into that plan to cover the setup costs. And I've read it could be, and they don't know how long that 2% is going to be in place. They said it could be 10 plus years or 20 years until they can make the fund self-sustaining.
Hugely complex to set up. Obviously, they thought it was a slam dunk. It's not as easy as some here are suggesting it could be.
I don't know all the details on how they've structured it, but they had to set up they had to hire a number of people to support it and build the systems, and it's anything on that scale, a national scale, is expensive, and our industry has invested in this for decades. So it's there.
Great. Thank you. We'll go to Mr. McKay again, please.
It seems to me that's a comparison between apples and oranges. I tend to think that this is a false comparison, because the CPP setting up an additional defined contribution plan is not rocket science. It can be run separately. There is an infrastructure already in place, and their return has thus far been at least as good as, if not better than, private sector funds. But anyways, that wasn't where I was going to go. It was with respect to this locked-in business, and it seems to me that your argument is essentially works for the mutual fund industry or the private sector administration, but it doesn't work necessarily for the folks who are in the plan. You could effectively be the next Nortel, and I'm the beneficiary in the next Nortel, and I'm stuck with a really lousy plan, because the ability of workers to access funds, especially employer contributions, make group RSPs unattractive to many employers. It also makes employers hesitant to match employee contributions. And you go further to say that when employees switch employers or retire, they would have the option to transfer only to another plan, another group RSP, or one offered by a new employer. So effectively it's a locked-in savings plan. I can't get at my money. So I don't understand why. I understand. I buy your argument that you lock them in to try and create a critical mass in order to be able to run a fund. What I don't understand is why, having said all of that, why if I feel your plan is awful, I can't get out of it.
There's a couple points in there. One is that you're referring to these as mutual funds. These are employer-sponsored plans, and I know that there's been earlier communication that the cost and the scale of employer-sponsored plans is very different than a retail mutual fund. It can be, for very large employers, it can be 50, 60 basis points when you aggregate all of those people together. That's what I'm talking about.
As opposed to 200 basis points? Okay.
Those are on individuals. Okay. This is a group.
Yeah.
So what the points I brought forward, all of those things that I put forward exist right now within a defined contribution pension that's regulated by a province. So all of the characteristics already exist under the pension legislation. What I'm suggesting or recommending is to allow those same characteristics within a group RRSP. So they work right now in a DC plan, a defined contribution plan, regulated by the provinces and the federal government. I'm asking that they also work within an RSP.
But suppose I was prescient and I saw your plan as the next Nortel, and I wanted to get out of this plan. For whatever reason, I just wanted to get out of this plan. According what you're recommending here is that I'm stuck. Is that correct?
It is. It's not like a Nortel plan because that's a defined benefit plan. But I'm saying while the employer sponsored it, you can stop your contributions. You can move your contributions out. But the employer's contribution should stay there while you're employed by that employer because they're putting that benefit to you.
So, okay, well, that's an interesting distinction. So you're saying I'm not stuck, but you as the employer is stuck.
The employers made the choice to put their plan there. They can move their plan. Yeah. Okay. The employer can.
Okay, that's a legitimate point. 1 minute left. Back to Mr. Hamilton here, who's been very popular this afternoon. Your first point was increase funding levels. And it just seems to me so blindingly obvious that if those funds... So can you just expand on that thought for a second, please?
The way you traditionally try to make benefits safer, if you're going to choose risky investments, is put more money aside than you think you need. So if you lose some of it, you've still got enough. Here's the problem with defined benefit plans. The employers don't want to do that because they're told if they put too much money aside and if things aren't bad, if they get good experience and the surplus gets large, there's no guarantee they'll ever be able to get it back. And so we put them in a system where we said you should all be very responsible and make sure those benefits are adequately secured, but if you over-secure them, you lose the money. And naturally, they find this a bit of like a rope-a-dope, where if they put too little aside, everybody criticizes them for exposing the members. If they put too much aside, everybody turns up and says, whoa, look at all that surplus, I guess that should be given away. And that's a problem. And unless that problem gets addressed, and there have been all sorts of proposals to address the problem, but nobody's done it, it's hard for the employers to do the thing that would most naturally address benefit security.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. McKay. We'll go to Mr. Wallace, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our guests today. It's been an excellent discussion that we've had, and I appreciate the input that you're providing. Obviously, there's no one answer to all the problems we're having with the pension issue, and we're looking at it here. The minister's going across the country with Ted looking at the issue. We're all having, I had a public meeting in my riding, and pension was not the whole meeting, but it was significantly a portion of the meeting. My question to the Chamber to begin with is, it's my understanding that multi-employee plans can exist as long as they're all within the same industry, or same grouping. You've indicated to a previous question that your members might be interested in plans that allow multi-employers, regardless of what industry they're in. Is that can you definitively tell me that your members, as chamber members, are actually demanding that issue in terms of the ability to have pension plans? And is it important in terms of not only their own future retirement, but retention of employees?
Thank you for that question. We've not asked our members if they would be interested in that option, because it's simply not something that we could legally offer them. So the question has never been tabled. Definitely, from our members' perspective, one of the things that they look for from membership is something that will reduce their overall costs, and any kind of a plan, whether it be auto insurance. We have plans for reduced costs for gasoline,
right.
A number of what we call affinity programs. What they do is provide greater access to more, especially for small business, at a lower cost, and some sort of system that allowed us to provide pensions where the individual employers would not have to incur these significant costs for administration.
Right.
That would be something that we would be happy to talk to companies about, some sort of group plan.
Okay. My next question is Mr. Pilot, is that what you said? If you have a copy of what your statement is, because I don't think I have it in front of me, maybe I do, I haven't seen this pile of paper here. I wouldn't mind a copy if you give it of your statement. There's a couple of things in terms of the taxes side. My view is we're not going to. There's no magic solution to this, and we need to find some things that make things. Your issue in terms of being able to make up for losses in your RRSP, in terms of increasing your contribution levels based on what your losses. I'm assuming that's what you're talking about. So if I lost money in my RRSP this year, but it doesn't really affect my contribution levels for next year, you're saying we should be able to do it. I'm not sure that's administratively possible, but I'm assuming it is. But it's an idea that I'd like to see. So anything that you had in terms of the tax pieces, I would appreciate if you could send it to the clerk so they can pass that around. Now, just for my own education here, you're listed as individual, a lawyer. Are you with a firm that just tax issues you deal with, retirement issues? I don't understand your background.
I was formerly with a consulting firm that, which was analogous to the firm, is analogous to the firm that Malcolm Hamilton belongs to. So my specialty is in pension law and also in the area of pension tax law. I do have a paper that I wrote in 2008 and published with the C.D. Howe Institute that I will certainly make available to you. And yes, this is what I was proposing in this paper, is that everybody's retirement savings be subject to a lifetime limit, which effectively would allow for catch-up retirement saving when people incur losses in the market.
We're hearing a bit about a voluntary program for CPP, an additional voluntary program. I don't understand personally how my contribution to my RRSP is voluntary. Isn't those with cash going to be taking advantage of it, and those who actually need to be saving, if it's voluntary? What advantage does that give them?
Well, I think that's a legitimate question, because really what a voluntary CPP is it's a big RSP in which everybody participates. So why is that better than participating in an RSP on your own? Well, there might be a couple of reasons. First of all, if you're putting your money into a fund which is professionally managed, like the CPP Investment Board does now, maybe your fees will be a little bit lower and your investment results a little bit better, because typically people don't choose their investments very well, and they don't do as well as large pension managers do with the money. The other advantage is that you don't have to think about it. But in essence, putting your money into a supplementary CPP is pretty much the same as putting it into an RSP, conceptually.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Yeah, if you can certainly send that to the clerk, and we'll distribute your report. Also, there was a mention, Mr. Hamilton, you mentioned the Mercer study earlier. That if the researchers, if we could get a copy of that as well, we'd appreciate that. We'll go to Mr. Marston now, please.
Well, I want to thank the guests today. It's been one of the better discussions that we've had in regards to pensions. A couple of quick things. It was mentioned before there was an economic crisis as opposed to a pension crisis, but that did cause people, because of Abitibi, Bowater, Fraser Paper, Nortel, and the list goes on, to step back and say, what can we do? And as we looked at things, we found out, that 300,000 Canadians live under $1,160 a month below the poverty line because they only collect GIS and OAS. And so that there was a critical problem there. Again, you've heard me say it several times, 63% of Canadians have nothing at this point. They're not doing anything. We had a witness say the other day that Canadians are pushing more debt forward than any other time in our history. So there's a number of things at play here. So I keep coming back to the foundation, like our public pension system, and that's why we talk about expanding CPP and in a mandatory way for those people who have made the choices. We're not trying to take away from the ones who have the discretionary monies to go further than that, but to try to ensure, we either pay now or we pay later. And Ms. Moran, there's something I'm going to say to the government that I think you should listen closely to. And that is that, you had Nortel with a situation of $2.4 billion in cash assets and about $4 billion, if the numbers are right, in other assets. And a lot of it's been transferred to a U.S. estate. And that's presented a real problem. To the government, I would suggest that somebody in the government side take a look at asking for equal opportunities to those estates under the terms of NAFTA, because I think that there's a potential opening there for that, and it should be followed up on. I really appreciate it. Now, Mr. Hamilton, a few minutes ago, you were about to make a comment, and you kind of got stopped. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I did want to comment on the fees in the British plan, because I'm not sure people are properly understanding that. But
no.
All right. So in essence, understand how these fees work. There's a fee on contributions, and then there's a fee on your assets. The fee on the asset, like if you trace a contribution, it goes in 1 year, typically it comes out 25 years later. You pay the fee on the contribution once, you pay the fee on the asset 25 times. So if you've got a system that's charging 2% per annum on assets,
that's huge.
Every dollar that goes in is paying 2% 25 times before it comes out. That's a third of your savings gone in fees. What the British did is they have a very low fee on assets, 30 basis points. They've introduced, albeit late in the game and everybody's upset, a 2% on contributions. But if you did a weighted average, if you said, I'm putting money away for 25 years, I pay 2% up front and 0.3% per year thereafter on the asset, what does that work out to as an equivalent charge per annum on the asset? It'd be about 0.4%. It's nothing like 2%.
Sure.
And the math there is very important, because if your retirement savers end up losing 5% of their savings along the way, they're hugely ahead of losing 30% of their savings along the way.
We certainly appreciate that cautionary on that. Back to the National Pension Insurance for a second. You talked about Ontario. That was introduced in the 90s, but it was chronically underfunded. It was ignored by three governments, three different parties over a period of time. I'm not so sure the concept might not have been good in the beginning, but there's no point having these plans unless we're going to fund them properly, or we have a way of funding them properly. I guess the bottom line for ourselves in this, for the NDP, is that we're looking at securing the foundation and the conditions that you've been asking for business over and above. We're not opposed to those. We're not a legislative change. We wouldn't be opposed to that at all. If we can manage across the spectrum in a fashion that takes care of those people at the bottom end and allows for other options, there's not a problem there. And I know I'm pretty well out of time.
There's 30 seconds for a very short response. Mr. Hannah.
NDP in the spot. So.
Okay. Ms. Rival, do you want to respond briefly?
I think we have to be careful on how broadly you make that statement too, because as Malcolm has said, the income earners that at the bottom end of the spectrum in Canada relative to other countries are well taken care of. there's been a lot of work. I understand that there's always individuals that are struggling, and that is unfortunate. But we do have a very strong pillar, first two pillars, and I think we have to look at where the challenges are in the middle income bracket, more so than focusing broadly across all.
Okay.
There's 300,000 below the poverty line.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Colleagues, it looks like there may not be a vote tonight. I think the vote is tomorrow. If the bells go, of course, we'll have to end the meeting. But if not, we'll go. I think we can fit 3 short rounds in. So we'll start with Mr. McKay.
Just wanted to pick up on Mr. Wallace's concern about RRSPs and the opportunity to refund, if you will, your RRSP. If in fact, for argument's sake, I lost $50,000 in my RRSP, do I and the rules were amended to put that money back in? Do I get an additional $50,000 worth of income tax deductions?
Repeat the last bit again.
Do I, in effect, get a $50,000? If I've lost $50,000 in my RRSP and I have $50,000 that I want to put back into my RRSP, and the rules are amended to allow that, would I get an additional deduction of $50,000 off my income tax?
Yes, you would. And the reason why is because what I've effectively proposed is to equalize the tax treatment between defined benefit plans and DC plans. So in a defined benefit plan, whatever is required to fund the benefit is tax deductible. So if the assets of the plan go down, such that there's not enough money for the benefit, you can put more in to top it up. And there's actually no conceptual limit to the amount of money that you can put in to top it up, and it's all deductible.
But isn't that a kind of a moral hazard argument, though? Because particularly if I'm self-administered, but even if I'm not self-administered, arguably, from if you will, a tax standpoint, it's advantageous to me to mismanage my RRSP.
I'm not sure how it could ever be advantageous to you to lose money.
It's a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah. Ultimately, even though you get the additional tax deduction, you're still going to be out of pocket more money.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
So,
but on the other hand, I'm also, in effect, the government's revenues are down by a similar amount of money.
They are down in respect of the tax deduction, but my point is that's already happening for the fortunate people in defined benefit plans, but it's not available to the people in the DC plans and the RSPs. So those people in the DC plans and RSPs, which are most private sector workers, they get lower overall contribution deduction room plus no ability to catch up.
Yeah.
So we've got really a two-class system here.
To show my great generosity, I'm going to share my remaining few seconds with Mr.
I probably have about 20 seconds. I just wanted to confirm one point with Mr. Hamilton. Are you saying that the British system, when you combine the 200 basis point contribution rate and the 30 basis point per year, that is equivalent to 40 basis points per year?
I'm guessing for somebody whose money is in 20, 25 years, it would work out to something like that. I mean, it's easy arithmetic to do.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure Mr. Menzies heard that. Thank you very much.
Can I add one comment?
Okay, Ms. Rival.
The analysis that has been done so far in Britain has actually equated it to about 1.5% for the immediate future, like for the next 10 years when they've done that. So what Malcolm does is when you look at it for 40 years, yes, it drops it down significantly, but they're looking at people that are 10 to 15 years away from retirement and what that cost is. So it depends on again, how you look at your math. But that's what I've been reading is they figure it's about 1.5%.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Monsieur Paez, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, just a brief comment on that. Obviously, it depends on the periods you're considering. The CPP might be in a good position currently. The problem is in 15 years or 20 years. when all the baby boomers, and there are a number of them around the table here, once they stop doing politics and retire, it's at that time that there will be a problem. You also indicated earlier that, Ms. Reibel, it could be dangerous to make generalizations about what our NDP colleague said. But there's also the opposite generalization. When you say the poorest in Canada are generally the best treated in the world, well, that's not a reason, however, to try to analyze and try to come up with improvements in terms of capacity in order to have better pensions for people, because there is still a lot of improvement. And when we hear about situations such as those experienced by Nortel or Atlas Steel employees, well, there's still a lot of room for improvement. And I would ask ourselves to be cautious with regard to cost analysis. Of course, we can talk about 50 basis points, 200 basis points, and all that, and raise scare scenarios. But this is a whole issue of management capability. Now, if you take the QPP compared to the CPP, the decision taken in the 70s in Quebec for having it entirely financed, well, that gave huge returns. Yes, there was 1 year, and Mr. Hamilton pointed that out. There was 1 year, 2008, when things went south, but when you have such a pension plan management model, you can't just look at 1 year. And to say that we'd lost 200, 300 billion in 2008, but in 2009 we'd have recovered the money. So you have to be careful with using statistics like that. But thank you for appearing before our committee.
The only comment I'd make there is it hasn't been made back. The one thing you got to understand about the pension math is if you lose 20% 1 year, you make 10% the next, you're still down 10%. But that's not the big thing. The big thing is you weren't supposed to do 0-0. The whole thing is planned on the assumption you're making 6% a year. So when you're supposed to do 6.6 and you end up minus 10, you're still 20% down from where you're supposed to be. So pension plans, notwithstanding the fact that 2009 was good, they're a long way from back to where they're supposed to be.
I
understand the math about it. If you lose 20%, 1 year you have to make 25% to come out at even. I understand that.
Even.
No,
You've got to get to plus 6.
Just to be zero.
Okay, merci. We'll finish. Mr. Menzies, please.
Thank you, Chair, and once again, thank you to our witnesses. This has been an excellent panel. Put a lot of good points out here. Ms. George, I noted Perrin Beatty's comments about all government working together, and in fact, in your presentation, you talked about that as well, all government levels working together. Some of the opposition think they've found the magic bullet and they've solved it, and we keep hearing that they have the conclusion already to fix it. I just want to note for your interest that in 5 different provinces that I have visited, and the Finance Minister and I have visited as of late, in PEI, the Finance Minister Wes Sheridan was there, Kevin O'Brien in St. John's, Dwight Duncan in London, Ontario, Ted Morton in Calgary, Roseanne Wojcik, sitting shoulder to shoulder beside the Finance Minister and taking notes and listening to people, and we still don't think we've got the exact answers. So I'd be encouraged to hear also from your members, and we appreciate this, but there is no magic bullet, but we hope that that coming out of this process that your members can provide even some more advice on this. Just a quick comment, if you will.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we are always very, very encouraged when the federal government and the provincial governments can work hand in hand on issues. It is the only way that we can make any substantive progress on these tough challenges in Canada. and all too often we see instead bun fights between the two levels of government. So we're encouraged by what we've seen. On your request for more input from Canadians, what we would be happy to send a notice out to our chambers across the country and encourage those that have views to submit them I assume you mean into the Finance Department's consultation.
Yes, we have an online consultation at the Finance Canada website.
Be happy to do that.
Very briefly.
I just need to address Mr. Pay's comment about an urban legend. Very quickly, I will share with the folks here the rural truth. Reflecting on the fact that if we change the creditor status in this issue, it will affect businesses. We're challenged in the rural areas right now. Farmers are signing general security agreements for a minimal part of their operating money for the year. They can't go back anywhere and get any more financing. So we need to be very, very cautious about crippling these companies by encumbering them with a similar situation with a creditor status. So we need to be very, very cautious. I would welcome Mr. Pay's visit out to my part of the world, and we'll show it to him.
Is it Bill for?
No, ran out of time for questions.
No bells.
Okay. Did you want to comment on that? Is that a final comment then?
That's fine. I won't abuse my time,
Okay.
Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Menzies. I do have, Mr. Wallace, you wanted to move your motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to move the motion which was handed out to request the Parliamentary Budget Officer to provide an estimate on the cost of Bill C-290, which is coming back to this. It's a Prime Minister's bill, which is coming back to this committee. Thank you. So I think it's information we all can use.
Any discussion, Monsieur Payet?
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, I would like to know from the Parliamentary Secretary whether the Minister of Finance trusts the Parliamentary Budget Officer. Because if he doesn't trust him, what's the purpose of this motion?
All opposed? That's unanimous. Thank you. That's carried. I do want to thank the witnesses, as was mentioned many times. This was an excellent panel, excellent suggestions brought forward. We appreciate that very much. If you have anything further you wish for the committee to consider, please forward that to the clerk. We will ensure all members get it. Thank you for your time today. Meeting adjourned.